Welcome to another episode of Indaba, the African Debate. My name is Mdudu Brian, and as always, I've got a guest with me. Oh no, not this time. This time I have two guests. Make it much more interesting. Today we'll be talking. You know what? I can't tell you what we'll be talking about, but you'll know as we go along. Let's dive in.
My name is Mamaili. I am from South Africa, small, little, well, it's not actually small, it's actually quite big province called Limpopo, and currently based in Johannesburg. I am a journalist, and yeah, that's about it from my side.
Thank you ever so much. Seabela, it's on you to introduce yourself, man.
Hi everyone, my name is Seabela. I'm also from South Africa in the province of Limpopo as well, in a village, or not really a village, in a place called Mujaji, Bulubedu. And yeah, that's where I'm based. Currently, I'm a student at UCT.
Brilliant. Thank you ever so much, guys, for that. Now, the direction of our conversation is being taken from what's been happening in KwaZulu-Natal, which is the issues around the monarch, where there are a few issues here and there. But generally, you look across Africa, one thing that's been being talked about in some corners of the continent is they've been talking about the restoration of monarchs in some parts. I know specifically the Ndebele people of Zimbabwe have also been talking about restoring their monarch, and they went all the way to the Zulu Kingdom and found a gentleman there who is one of the descendants of the Kumalos. Now, I'm always a bit conflicted when it comes to the monarchs because I see they're good. I see why some people will be against them. And more often than not, I always find myself very conflicted as to what is it that they offer in this modern day and age. And I guess maybe that's where we can sort of really start it from. In your perspective, guys, what do monarchs offer in this modern day and age?
Well, I think, a monarch is like any other system of governance, and it offers leadership and direction that, its people are expecting from it. That's why monarchs tend to reinvent themselves over time. The British monarchy of now is not the British monarchy of, when the Windsors took over initially, especially with Queen Elizabeth's reign, there had to be constant reinventing so that it can adapt to the times of now. But when we look at, Africa and South Africa in particular, the point that's always driven home is that monarchs they're like a cultural hub of some sort. They preserve culture. But for me, I think that's the what else factor, because monarchs offer all sorts of services that our government offers. They offer administrative services. They are often at the forefront of championing service delivery, concerns of the citizens. And especially now of late, where we talk about social licenses, where companies come into villages and try to operate from there, monarchs have been at the forefront of trying to protect the interests of the people who live in and around those areas. So I think the only issue is that when it comes to monarchs, especially from the African perspective, people are always very quick to highlight the negatives and no positives, and usually it's people who don't particularly live within those particular areas. And it's very tricky for me, because then the people themselves say that we want a king, we want a chief, we want a queen. They're the ones that say that. And who are we, from urban areas to say that, no, these people are not good enough, they don't deserve the salaries that they earn, they don't deserve the positions and the prestige that it comes with, they should be done away with. They offer all the services that you would find in any democratic structure in this country. And it's just often easier for people who live in those areas, who are faced by very harsh inequalities, to access these services from a monarch versus a court, which is a very expensive, draining process for somebody who doesn't have the money to even afford 3 square meals a day, for example. So I think those who say that they're not relevant, speak from a very high point of privilege, obviously, but also from a position of not knowing what it's like to not be able to access services and having the monarch as the only starting point for you to be able to access these. So that's just kind of like where I come from with that discussion.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you for that. Seabela, one thing that there's been mentioned is the case of how do they operate in this sort of modern day urbanized society? How do you operate a monarch in a modernized society? I'm also assuming that you sort of share the same sentiments when it comes to what the monarchs do offer.
Yes, yes, definitely. And I think that she gave, a great starting point to this question that you asked. Looking at, basically to summarize what you just said is that this is an indigenous system of governance, basically, that has been, the modern system has tried to replace, and they failed a couple of times. And instead of phasing it out, what they've done is now they've relegated to a certain level and to make it seem smaller, which is why people mostly in the urban areas wouldn't relate to the indigenous system of governance, because they get their services from civil governance. Those of us who have gotten services from both kind of know the value, and we're in a good position to contrast the two and determine which one is more valuable. So what we find today throughout most of Africa is that there is, a co-governance of sort between these two systems. But what is important to note is that people don't, like, the government doesn't, civil governance doesn't value monarchs. It's like a deal they made. Okay, you'll be there, we won't destroy you, but we're the government. We're the government. Oh, nerves, guys, what's going on? we're the government. So yeah, I think that's basically the coexistence is not there, and it's framed in such a way that it favors, the colonial government, because that's where our civil governance comes from. That's the root. That's where it started. The nation state. It's rooted in colonialism. So the colonial system of governance has kind of taken a superior stance, a position over our indigenous systems.
Now, I see you nodding your head there. I knew this was going to happen. Mamaili, I see you nodding your head. And I suppose you sort of agree, but I'm still really caught up on this. How do you replace it in the modern day sort of urbanized area? Because people are so used to their sort of civil government, so one can say. How do you then convince them that no, we can still have the same setup that we have now, but instead we just have a very different figurehead? Because most of them are now worried, do we vote them in? Do we vote them out? If we're unhappy, what do we do? What next? So I guess to a certain degree, one can say, have we been brainwashed by this so-called notion of democracy?
Well, look, remember that as African people, we are people who have agency, right? And we can pick and choose what system of governance, well, ideally, we should be able to pick and choose what system of governance we would want to be governed under. And some people tend to lean into both systems, some people borrow the very good aspects of monarchies, and some people borrow the very good aspects of a democracy, because democracies aren't perfect, especially the one that we have here in South Africa, So I don't think it's to convince people that let's replace this either or mentality. For me, is it's not working, because you could actually leverage very good parts of both and make them work for you, which is what a lot of people who have access to both, urban and very type of rural settings are able to do, So I don't think there's a need to, replace it. As people who know that there is value in, for example, a monarchy, we should be able to say, look at the monarchy and ask ourselves, is this something that's working for us? Are there things that need to change, etc., etc.? Which in that case, we've been able to do very well because we've got direct access to monarchies. However, in a democratic state, it's very, very difficult because, you look at South Africa, for example, an overwhelming majority belongs to the ANC. So we can't necessarily go to the ANC and be like, there are certain aspects of government that we don't really like and we need for them to be changed. Only when such things start to, really affect the elite in this country, that's when we'd actually see some change. Whereas monarchies tend to work for all, and the rules don't, kind of like change because you have more prestige or power or whatever. And the idea that monarchies are not democratic is also very like false, because royal councils are made up of, somebody from each key constituency in a particular village or in a particular kingdom. So you've got people from families, you've got people from other chieftaincies coming through and saying that this is our chosen person, this is who's going to represent us in the royal council. And their contributions to whatever would be taking place at the time, whatever decision needs to be made, they're taken into account on a very high level, Whereas you look at democracy, anything the ANC says goes, pretty much. Who elects the ANC? About 2,000 branches in South Africa. Do those 2,000 branches reflect the voices of all South Africans? It's a hard no from me, So it's like, monarchy is actually more democratic than people realize, because at times when people feel this ruler is not what we envisioned for our particular village, for our particular kingdom, there are calls from the ordinary people in those spaces to say, no, actually, we believe XYZ is the rightful king, and we would rather be ruled by them. And you've seen in history when people felt, Shaka Zulu's, method of ruling is not preferred, people fled and started their own kingdoms. Isn't that democratic? Isn't that saying, I'd rather not be, here, I'd rather be somewhere else. I'd rather speak a different way. I'd rather dress a different way. I'd rather be in a different area with different rules. It's a very, very democratic process. And it's a democracy that's very, very accessible to the ordinary person. Currently, some people can't even vote because they can't afford transport money to go to a voting station because they live in such remote areas that the government doesn't care for. Is that a real democracy if it's not accessible to just everyone? So I don't think we need to have an either or approach. You can leverage positives from both, and you can find that one system makes the other one better. Monarchs always call out the democratic government for their failures, because their people are suffering, obviously. And that's just one thing where I'm very confused as to, if you haven't experienced this particular system, how would you know that it's bad? I've experienced democracy. I can tell you it's failing in much detail, but I've got friends who haven't experienced the monarchy telling me that it's bad. And as a woman, I've seen monarchies do more for women empowerment than the democratic government. So that's just like, I don't think, let me just stop there because I've got so many feelings about this.
You bring up a very important aspect, though, when most people start talking about how monarchy isn't representative of, it doesn't represent women in society. Monarchy doesn't take women's rights, so to speak, in the modern sort of flex, doesn't take women's rights seriously. Monarchy doesn't represent women in every part of the way. Seabela, does patriarchy exist within the monarchy? Now, you've been doing some very interesting work, actually, and within the work, what have you seen? What have you learned, both in just a general sense and in the sense that in the patriarchy perspective? Does it exist? If not, how does it not exist? All those kind of things.
I mean, in any society, there is an inequality between the two genders, and it would be false to sell a notion that says that there is no patriarchy in monarchs or African, indigenous systems of governance. However, there is a misconception as to what type and to what extent this patriarchy exists within these societies and structures. And I'll give her an example. Where I come from, we've been led by women for the past 200 years, where the throne was strictly matrilineal, where queens, even though we don't have that word in my language, both rulers, whether male or female, are referred to as Kosi. So our Kosis for the past 200 years have been female by birthright, not by marriage. So I was doing research on your people, the Ndebele people as well, and I realized that there is a status that is given to the king's wives. And they were not only, wives for reproductive purposes, but they were also political agents. They served as, diplomats or messengers between the constituent chiefs and the monarch. So those are just some of the things that people overlook. And again, it goes back to colonialism and how it has, portrayed and represented our cultures. If you look at where I come from also, even though the monarch is a woman, she is symbolically wed to other women who, again, are chosen by the nation. And they also occupy this political, prestigious space as a wife, and they're given the title Batanoni. So again, there's been a miscommunication between Africa and the world as to how our monarchies work, who has agency in which way, and how things work. The problem of homogenizing everything. We've got this one image, again, one-sided story of what a monarch in Africa looks like, that the succession is always patriarchal, that the council is only men and the chiefs can only be men. And that is a false notion. If you go out through Africa, there are actually diverse ways in which women show political agency within these monarchs. And, in a number of ways, if you go back to the Bible, I mean, the Queen of Sheba is from Africa, and, she's a queen by birthright. Queen, is it Nzunza in Sierra Leone, Queen Mujaji, where I'm from, Queen Mantatisi. And there are a lot of other people that are coming up and saying, in my particular village, lineage, or society, there has been a history of queens, and those stories have not been told. And I want us to be very careful here to not only focus on the monarch herself, if we're talking about, feminism in African societies. Let's look at the entire structure, because what use would it serve if we only had a female monarch and everybody else was male, which is the picture that comes into mind when people speak of, no, but the society had a queen. They only think of that person as female and everybody else as male. But if you investigate, if you read, into the literature and our history, there are a lot of, positions along the hierarchy where women serve very important roles in society.
Yeah, sorry. And just to add on that, when you think about African monarchies, because of the documentation process of, what is now known as the Zulu Kingdom, there's a very important figure in that particular monarchy being Princess Nkabai. You know what I'm saying? And it's like, that particular monarchy is seen as the most arrogant, proud, rich, monarchy, at least from Southern Africa. Let me not speak from an African lens, but it's very, very notable. And it starts where Shaka Zulu becomes, chief of his Zulu, his little, Zulu chiefdom, and then, eventually transforming it into a whole Zulu kingdom and pulling together all these chieftaincies in what is now known as KwaZulu-Natal to become under one Zulu kingdom. And who was key in that? It was Nkabai, right? Daughter of I think daughter of King Jama. I'm not really sure, but
yeah.
She basically made it possible for her father to have the son known as Senzanga Khona, who's Shaka's father, who then gave birth to about 3 or 4 kings from his lineage alone. She made that possible. She structured it that way. She literally was very meticulous in that undertaking. But you look at the Zulu Kingdom today and how it's represented in media, and it's just like Shaka or Dingane or Zwelithini or what, but who made that possible? And that was just, king making of the highest order. I've never seen or heard of anything like that, and it's just very weird when people try to reduce women's role in monarchies to giving birth and basically just brushing the ego of the current monarch who's a man. It's very, very false.
I think the argument can also be made that the current king was sort of the Zulu nation, sort of was, how can one say, was sort of rubber stamped by the former queen, the late queen. So one can use that as well as a classic example. Now, one thing that you guys have mentioned is small chieftainships making up a kingdom. Now, one of the things that is very unique about our continent is having a lot of different and diverse ethnic groups. You look at Nigeria, for example, they have over 300 diverse different ethnic groups. You look at South Africa on its own, you look at even Namibia, Botswana, as much as they seem like they're one Tswana tribe, there's also small little nuances within the Tswanas and other groups such as the Kalanga. How do we make it work in a country that was carved out without taking consideration to all of these different nuances? How do we then make a modern day monarch work and say, fine, we've got this, how do we structure it around what problems we're having around the ethnic sort of debate?
I guess that would have to be determined by the people, currently we have, a very middle class generation that's kind of losing their grip on whatever esteem that they had, maybe in the past 20 years. And the democracy is not working very well for them. And the reality is that majority of the youth in this country, because of inequality, will come from areas where monarchies sort of rule, So that would entirely be determined by them. Would people want a monarch that rules and governs? I don't see how it would work currently in South Africa because we're just so huge and diverse, and you can't exactly attribute a monarch to, for example, a certain province, because our provinces within themselves are very, diverse. So you could find for example, in the Eastern Cape, which is often, aligned with the Xhosa kingdom, you do find people who are Sotho, Basotho within those kingdoms who would have chieftaincies in the Free State and a kingdom in Lesotho. So I don't know how it would work on a governance perspective. Maybe it might, things change all the time. I don't think the current system that we have is, how it was sort of like established, is something that's not workable. It's just that there's a dishonesty from the ruling, sort of elite about the kind of power that they give to monarchs. Because currently there are no administrative powers that they give the monarchs. It's sort of like everything that they decide on, even if it's like a case before the tribal courts or whatever, it certainly doesn't stand until the judiciary stamps, give their stamp of approval or whatever. And we've seen the judiciary can sometimes get things wrong. So there's just a very dishonest notion of we are co-governing, because we've seen a lot of the times the government getting too involved in issues that have to do with monarchies. We've seen the judiciary getting too involved, and it doesn't work the other way around. A king of the Zulu nation, for instance, can't go to the government and say, I don't agree with this particular approach, and they take that into account with the seriousness that he's saying that. But a government can do that to a king and a monarchy. I'm not entirely convinced that how it was established is wrong, but the carrying out of it and the power that government flexes at times, is making it seem like it can't work. But I think the intentions were true and pure. And, government knows that they need these traditional leaders to get ahead. If you don't co-sign them in their existence and they legitimate governance over these small villages, nobody's really going to listen to you. Nobody's really going to want to vote for you, because the reality is that these monarchs have a lot of power and influence over our people because they are put there by the people, So it is something that can work, but under the current application, I don't think it's something that should be allowed to continue. And, it's very unfortunate in my view, because there were good intentions behind it.
Maybe just to add on
certainly.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe
Yes,
just
by
to
all
add on
means
that. I
do.
think the problem starts with the work of ethnographers in Africa, and how they've, what's the word I'm looking for? They've oversimplified, our structure, our cultures, and the way that we do things. So it looks as if, okay, everybody's Basotho, so we'll just cluster you into this one thing, and you will have this king or whatever. And like, for example, the Ndebele people don't have a paramount, and that was okay because they knew how to govern themselves without a paramount. Some societies did, some others didn't. And now the problem comes in when government is lazy to look into these nuances and therefore determine a way forward that would work for everybody else, because the implications would be far reaching. Right now in South Africa, there's this thing called customary law. And one thing that I always question is, whose custom are you using to determine customary law? Because, for example, say before 2006, I think, same-sex marriages weren't allowed in South Africa. However, we had, even though it wasn't marriage in a Western sense, but it would qualify to call it that, where our queen now has to take people titled wives. How would we recognize that officially? And things like, our queens where I'm from, when they give birth, those children do not have a paternity. It's not recognized, and that makes sense to us. But then we had a case in, I think, in the early 2010s, where somebody came and claimed the paternity of our monarch, and that was a taboo. But in Western systems, that you have a mother and a father, and that's how things are in Western case. But in Kilobedu, that's not how things are for everyone. So if government invests, and this would require a lot of research and therefore a lot of money, if government would invest in that, I think maybe, we'd have some, not really balance, but, it's a step in the right, it would be a step in the right direction.
I really like your point when you're talking about sort of this blanket approach to things, that as if things never existed before. I really like that, because I, for example, coming from Zimbabwe, often people say, oh, the Zimbabwean culture is like this. And I'm often taken aback, because I'm like, is there Zimbabwean culture? I don't see a Zimbabwean culture, because half of the things I deem my culture, the Shona people don't deem as their culture. Half of the things I deem my culture, the Donga people don't deem their culture. The Kalangas don't deem their culture. And what makes even, I think, Zimbabwe much more interesting is because you have pockets as well within the Ndebele regions, where you have the Xhosas, you have the Sutu, you have all of those people within their own little corners, have their own way of doing things and their own cultural practices. So I find it very problematic. And I love that point when you're talking about lazy government. And I find it very problematic when someone says, oh, there's just a culture for Nigerians. There simply isn't. Or there's a cultural dress for Nigerians. There's a cultural dress for the people of Namibia. There simply isn't. Each ethnic group has its own sort of cultural reflections. And with those cultural reflections, having somebody that sort of has the best interests of not only those cultural reflections, those people's interests, those people's style of life, those people's governance, probably is maybe what we just need at this present moment. Because I take a leaf out of even this. It's a very basic example, but you look at even in the UK, the Welsh people demanded that Welsh as a language becomes part of Wales, that even the street signs need to have Welsh names next to them. Anything, if you go to Wales right now, anything, it's got its English name and then its Welsh name with it. They demanded this. And this is quite, in historic senses, this is quite recent, in the past 30, 40 years or so. They demanded this and say, listen, we also want our own sort of reflective representation. And this is where the growth of devolution sort of happened within the country, because the monarch had decided that, you know, we've defeated everybody, we've brought all the kingdoms together, and the only monarch that will exist is just our monarch. But some parts they didn't really take into consideration how some other corners of the country felt. So I think what I'm trying to tie this in together is to say both sides do work. We just need to find a unique way of making it African. And I think this is where the challenge slightly is. Just before we finish off, guys, Seabela, just give us a brief sort of understanding of the work you've been doing and any reflections you draw from that work.
I speak from a lived experience mostly, and as somebody who's still based in the village, I'm very vocal on social media, on a lot of platforms, radio, about, you know, the misconceptions that we've attached to African people, African societies, their history and indigenous ways. So I'm very vocal about female leadership because I happen to come from a society that has been led at the forefront by a woman for the past 200 years. And I think that that's what people find interesting. But there are scores of other, cultures and traditions with their own, unique ways. For example, I'm currently doing some research on the Ndebele people because as Northern Sotho people, we've interacted with the Ndebele people who we call Matebele, where I come from. Yeah. And I find out there are people who carry Ndebele culture and identity, even though they don't speak the language. And those are some of the things that I find interesting and I'm very vocal about on my platforms.
Yeah, Mamaili, what are your reflections around this conversation? How do we move it on? And what is the best style of governance for Africa in your perspective?
Yeah, well, for me, it'll also be on a lived experience type of thing. And, that's because I've seen monarchs actively have a very good influence within my family alone. There are many examples I can cite, but there are instances where we wouldn't have had justice had it not been because of the presence of a monarch. I don't come from a very rich background, and I'm talking in terms of the larger family. And it's not always easy to get on, to a taxi and go see a lawyer and then go, start court proceedings. Whereas I know in my tribal houses, I can walk there and they can come to my house and solve a dispute that would not get anywhere in terms of like a legal system, because even if I have money, what if my cousin doesn't have money for a lawyer, and, it would just take way too long for us to see the justice that we so need, or to reach a decision where both of us are happy. So it'll always be from a lived experience point of view, because a lot of my family still live in these places where they are governed by monarchs. Is this to say that monarchs are perfect and without mistake? No, I would never suggest that at all. But there is no system of governance that is perfect. And why is it so easy for people to pick on the one that offers people the most justice within this very unjust world that we're living in? And I'll never stop preaching the gospel of there needs to not be an either or approach. People can just be happy with what they are comfortable being governed under. And, there is no rule in South Africa that forces you to be governed under a monarch. People can pick and choose in that regard. We are forced to be governed by, democracy, which, we've seen has not worked well for us. Maybe if we look at the pandemic alone, we've seen it not work very well for us, but we can't like pull back and say, okay, democracy, it's done. We don't want you. But we are able to pick and choose from a monarch point of view. We run institutions as a family that support the monarch. And those work very well as well for cultural reference, for just documenting purposes. And, I keep saying that you really can't take the Africanness out of somebody. I grew up in urban settings, although I do have ties to, the villages and all of that. But when I hear something that reminds me of home, whether through music, whether through reading, I connect with it instantly. And the one thing right now that I can go and have actual physical reference of that Africanness is a monarch. And wherever a monarch has been imperfect, a monarch has been called to order, a monarch has been removed, a monarch has been replaced. This is well documented with the Balobedu people right now. Men weren't working for them and they said, well, we want women now. And the current developments that are happening there currently tells you that when the people say that we want this because this is not working for us, it happens. And it all starts with the people. Until the people say that we do not want a king or a queen, I don't think anybody has any right to say, well, this is, and with a monarch, you can always leave that particular village and go to a village where you feel we can self-determine, or we can be under a monarch that meets our specific needs. And really, that's that.
Brilliant. Guys, thank you ever so much for today. We will certainly have a part 2 if you guys permit, but the part 2 will be slightly different because we will bring in a couple of people who are very much against anything to do with the monarch at all within the African context.
We're used to those. They don't scare us.
Mamaili, thank you very much.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having us.
And Seabela, thank you ever so much.
Thank you so much. Looking forward to next time.
All righty, bye guys.
I always say that it's always telling the fact that, one of the biggest empires in the world, the first things they did when they went out to different countries is destroy their style of governance, and majority of them were monarchs. And they kept theirs intact and is still intact up to today. That for me is telling the power that the style of governance had in its day. Of course, it would have evolved to a different style today as they have evolved themselves. Her name is Mamaila. His name is Seabela. I am Dudu Zibrine. This has been Indaba, the African Debate. Thank you for watching. Bye for now.